The sound reached Sister Catherine first. 3 sharp knocks, then silence, then 3 more. The pattern they'd agreed upon 6 months earlier when the network had first approached the convent with a request that would test every vow she'd ever taken. She rose from evening prayers, her rosary still warm in her hands, and moved through the darkened corridor toward the kitchen door. Outside, rain hammered the cobblestones of Chartres Street, providing cover for the woman who stood trembling in the alley, one hand pressed against the brick wall for support, the other cradling the swell of her belly beneath a stolen coat, 3 sizes too large. "They're 2 blocks behind me," the woman whispered, her voice raw from running. "The dogs lost my scent at the river, but Mercier's men are checking every building." Sister Catherine could hear them now, boots on stone, voices calling coordinates, the systematic sweep of men who hunted human beings for profit. She pulled the woman inside, locked the door, and made a decision that would either save 2 lives or condemn an entire religious community to legal destruction. Before we continue with what happened in those desperate hours, I need you to understand something about the story you're about to hear. This isn't just history. It's a blueprint for moral courage that our generation has systematically erased from collective memory. If you believe that faith without action is hollow, that institutions can be instruments of liberation, and that the most radical act is protecting the vulnerable when the law itself has become an instrument of oppression, then subscribe to this channel right now. And after you've heard what these women risked, comment below with the name of your city, because this story happened in New Orleans in 1857, but the choice it represents is timeless. We're building a community of people who refuse to let these acts of resistance disappear. Join us. Now let me take you back to how Sister Catherine ended up opening that door. The convent of the Sisters of the Holy Family sat on a narrow lot in the French Quarter, wedged between a cotton broker's office and a boarding house that catered to river pilots. The order had been founded in 1842 by Henriette de Lille, a free woman of color who'd renounced a future as a placée, the formalized mistress system that trapped mixed-race women in New Orleans' rigid caste structure, to establish a religious community dedicated to educating enslaved and free black children, nursing the sick, and sheltering the elderly who had no one else. By 1857, the convent housed 12 sisters, operated a school for 60 children, and maintained a hospital ward that treated patients the city's white institutions refused. They existed in a legal gray zone that required constant negotiation. Louisiana's Code Noir and subsequent statutes had created a 3-tiered racial system: white, free people of color, and enslaved. The Sisters of the Holy Family occupied the middle tier, which meant they could own property, operate businesses, and move through the city with relative freedom, but they could not vote, testify against white people in court, or publicly challenge the institution of slavery. Their very existence was a quiet rebuke to the system, but they'd learned to operate within its constraints, providing education and care while avoiding direct confrontation with the planter class that controlled the city's economy and politics. Sister Catherine had joined the order in 1851 at 19 after watching her mother die of cholera in a charity ward where the white doctors refused to touch black patients. She'd been educated by the sisters as a child, had learned to read using a primer they'd smuggled past laws prohibiting literacy instruction for people of color, and had felt a calling that transcended the limited options available to free women of color in antebellum New Orleans. She'd taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but on this October night in 1857, she was about to discover that obedience to God and obedience to Louisiana law were incompatible commitments. The woman she'd pulled through the door was named Marie. She was 23 years old, 7 months pregnant, and legally the property of Edouard Mercier, a sugar planter who owned 3,000 acres upriver in St. James Parish, and a townhouse on Esplanade Avenue where he kept his city slaves, the domestic workers who served him during the social season. Marie had been born on Mercier's plantation, had been taught to sew by her mother, and by age 15 had been brought to New Orleans to work as a lady's maid for Mercier's wife. She was valued in his ledgers at $200, a price that reflected her skills, her youth, and her light complexion, which in the twisted economics of slavery increased her market value. She'd run because Mercier had decided that her unborn child, fathered by his nephew during a visit the previous winter, would be sold at birth to settle a gambling debt. The nephew had lost $800 at a faro table on Bourbon Street, and Mercier had promised the creditor a healthy infant, suitable for raising as house staff. Marie had overheard the conversation while serving coffee in the parlor. She'd understood immediately that she had perhaps 3 months to act, and that the law offered her no protection. Under Louisiana statute, enslaved women had no legal right to their children. The child would be born into slavery, would be classified as property from its first breath, and could be sold away from its mother at any age for any reason. So, she'd run. Not impulsively, but with a plan assembled over 6 weeks of careful preparation. She'd made contact with the network through a free woman of color who sold vegetables at the French market, a woman who knew which households would hide runaways, which ship captains would look the other way, which routes led north. The network had told her to wait until the rain came, until the dogs would be useless, until Mercier was distracted by business. And then, on this October evening, she'd slipped out through the kitchen door while the household was at dinner, had walked calmly through the quarter as if running an errand, and had made it to the convent door with Mercier's hired hunters, just minutes behind her. Sister Catherine led her down a narrow staircase to the cellar, a low-ceilinged space beneath the chapel where the sisters stored preserves, candles, and medical supplies. In the far corner, behind a rack of shelving, was a door that most of the sisters didn't know existed, a remnant of the building's previous life as a warehouse, leading to a small room that had once been used for storing valuable goods. The room was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single ventilation grate near the ceiling and no windows. Sister Catherine had discovered it during her first year in the convent, had mentioned it to Mother Superior Juliette Godin, and had been told quietly, "Some knowledge is best kept among those who might need to use it." Now she understood why. She settled Marie on a pallet of blankets, brought her water and bread, and explained the situation with brutal clarity. "You cannot leave this room until we find a way to move you north. Mercier will search every building in the quarter. He has the law on his side. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 makes it a federal crime to harbor runaways, punishable by 6 months in prison and a $1,000 fine. If we're caught, the convent will be closed, our property seized, and every sister here will face criminal charges. But if we turn you away, you and your child will be separated, and you'll likely be sold downriver as punishment for running." Marie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "I won't let them take my baby. Whatever happens to me, I won't let them do that." Sister Catherine nodded. "Then we'll find a way. But you need to understand, this isn't just about hiding you. We need to change your legal status, and there's only one person in this city with the authority to do that." She was talking about Bishop Antoine Blanc, the head of the Catholic Diocese of New Orleans, a man who wielded enormous influence over the city's religious and civic life. Under Louisiana law, there was a legal mechanism, rarely used, politically dangerous, but technically valid, by which enslaved people could be granted freedom through ecclesiastical intervention. If a bishop certified that an enslaved person had been baptized, had received religious instruction, and was living as a practicing Catholic, he could petition the civil courts to grant manumission on the grounds that enslaving a devout Catholic violated the spiritual principles of the faith. It was a loophole that existed because Louisiana's legal code had been shaped by French and Spanish colonial law, which had been more influenced by Catholic doctrine than the Anglo-American slave codes that governed most of the South. But it required the bishop's personal involvement, his willingness to risk political capital, and his presence to testify before a judge. And Bishop Blanc was currently in Rome, attending a convocation of American bishops. He wasn't expected back in New Orleans for 6 weeks. Sister Catherine returned upstairs and found Mother Superior Juliet in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. She explained the situation in whispers, her words echoing softly off the vaulted ceiling. Mother Superior listened without interrupting, her face unreadable in the candlelight. When Sister Catherine finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Mother Superior spoke. "We have hidden people before. We have provided shelter for the sick, the elderly, the abandoned. But this is different. This is direct defiance of federal law. This is risking everything we've built, the school, the hospital, the community we serve. If we're discovered, it won't just be us who suffer. Every family that depends on this convent will lose the only institution that serves them." "I know," Sister Catherine said, "but if we don't act, we're complicit in the separation of a mother and child. We're saying that our institutional survival matters more than their lives." Mother Superior closed her eyes. "How long until the bishop returns? 6 weeks, maybe 7. Can we keep her hidden that long if we're careful, if we're disciplined, if God protects us?" Mother Superior stood, her joints cracking softly. She was 62 years old, had spent 40 years building this order from nothing, had navigated the treacherous politics of a city where free people of color existed on sufferance. She'd made compromises, had bitten her tongue during sermons that justified slavery, had smiled at donors who owned human beings. But there were lines she would not cross. "We'll need a system," she said, "rules that every sister follows without exception. No one speaks of this outside these walls. No one visits the cellar without permission. We rotate who brings food and water, so no single person becomes a pattern. And we pray, every hour we pray that Mercier's search moves on, that the bishop returns safely, and that we have the strength to see this through." They gathered the other sisters that night after Compline, the final prayer service of the day. Mother Superior explained the situation in stark terms. A pregnant woman was hiding in their cellar, federal law made sheltering her a crime, and they would all face consequences if discovered. She gave each sister a choice: leave now with no judgment, or stay and accept the risk. Every sister stayed. Over the following days, they built a routine designed to minimize suspicion. Sister Catherine, who managed the convent's medical supplies, had a legitimate reason to visit the cellar daily. She brought Marie food, water, clean linens, and news from above. Sister Thérèse, who taught at the school, created a schedule of prayer rotations that ensured someone was always in the chapel, directly above the hidden room, ready to warn Marie if unexpected visitors arrived. Sister Marguerite, who handled the convent's finances, began quietly liquidating small assets, selling silver candlesticks, old furniture, donated jewelry, to build a fund that could pay for Marie's passage north once the bishop's intervention secured her freedom. The first week was the most dangerous. Mercier's men searched the quarter building by building, offering a $200 reward for information leading to Marie's capture. They knocked on the convent door on the 3rd day, 2 hard-faced men with legal writs, authorizing them to search any property suspected of harboring fugitives. Mother Superior met them at the door with icy politeness, informed them that the convent was a religious institution under the protection of the diocese, and offered to send for the bishop's representative if they wished to proceed. The men hesitated. Searching a convent without clear evidence was politically risky, potentially offensive to the city's Catholic establishment, and left with a warning that they'd return if any evidence emerged. Sister Catherine stood in the chapel, directly above the hidden room, and felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might be audible. Below, Marie sat in absolute silence, one hand over her mouth, the other on her belly, feeling her child move and praying that it wouldn't kick hard enough to make a sound. The men didn't return. After 2 weeks, Mercier's active search ended. He posted notices in the newspapers offering the $200 reward, filed a report with the city's fugitive slave registry, and returned to his plantation, confident that Marie would eventually be caught trying to leave the city or would starve in whatever hole she'd crawled into. He didn't know that she was being fed 3 meals a day, that she was receiving prenatal care from Sister Catherine, who'd trained as a midwife, and that she was surrounded by women who'd made her survival their sacred mission. But hiding Marie was only the first challenge. Keeping her hidden for 6 weeks, and then 7 when word came that the bishop's return was delayed, required a level of operational discipline that tested every sister's resolve. The cellar room was cold, damp, and dark. Marie developed a cough in the 3rd week that terrified Sister Catherine, who feared pneumonia but couldn't call a doctor without risking exposure. She treated Marie with herbal remedies, warm compresses, and constant prayer, and the cough eventually subsided. Marie's pregnancy progressed normally, but the isolation wore on her. She spent hours in darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of the convent above, footsteps, prayers, the voices of children in the school, and fighting the terror that she'd be discovered, that her child would be born in this hidden room and taken from her anyway. Sister Catherine visited her every evening after Vespers, bringing food and staying to talk. They spoke about Marie's childhood on the plantation, about the mother she'd been separated from at age 12 when Mercier had brought her to New Orleans, about the skills she'd learned and the dreams she'd had before she'd understood that her life was not her own. Marie asked Sister Catherine about the convent, about what it meant to choose a religious life, about whether faith could survive in a world this cruel. "I don't know," Sister Catherine admitted one night, sitting on the floor beside Marie's pallet. "Some days I think faith is the only thing that makes survival possible. Other days I think faith is just a story we tell ourselves to avoid facing how broken everything is." "Then why stay?" Marie asked. "Because even if it's a story that makes me capable of opening that door when you knocked. And right now, that feels like enough." The bishop finally returned in late November, 7 weeks after Marie had arrived. Mother Superior sent word through official channels requesting an urgent private audience, citing a matter of conscience requiring episcopal guidance. The bishop, who'd known Mother Superior for 20 years and trusted her judgment, agreed to visit the convent the following day. He arrived in the late afternoon, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the weary bearing of someone who'd spent decades navigating the impossible contradictions of maintaining a Catholic diocese in a slave society. Mother Superior met him in the parlor, offered him tea, and explained the situation with the same directness she'd used with her sisters. A pregnant enslaved woman was hiding in their cellar. They'd been sheltering her for 7 weeks in violation of federal law, and they needed his intervention to secure her legal freedom before her child was born. The bishop set down his teacup with a hand that trembled slightly. "You understand what you're asking me to do? The political consequences? The precedent this sets? I understand that we're asking you to choose between the law of man and the law of God," Mother Superior said. "And I understand that this choice will cost you. But these women have already paid everything. We're just asking you to use the authority you have to protect them." The bishop closed his eyes. He'd spent his career making compromises, finding ways to minister to enslaved people while not alienating the planter class that funded his churches, schools, and hospitals. He'd baptized enslaved infants knowing they'd grow up in bondage. He'd married enslaved couples knowing their unions had no legal standing and could be dissolved by sale. He'd preached about Christian charity while accepting donations from men who bought and sold human beings. He'd told himself it was necessary, that the church could do more good by working within the system than by challenging it directly. But this was different. This was a direct request to act, to use his ecclesiastical authority to free a specific woman and her unborn child, to take a public stand that would be recorded in legal documents and remembered by everyone who learned of it. "Let me meet her," he said finally. They brought him to the cellar, to the hidden room where Marie had spent 7 weeks in darkness. She stood when he entered, her belly swollen, her face gaunt from weeks of limited food and no sunlight, her eyes bright with a desperate hope that made the bishop's throat tighten. He asked her about her faith, about her baptism, about her understanding of Catholic doctrine. She answered every question with a clarity that came from years of secret religious instruction, because teaching enslaved people to read was illegal, but teaching them catechism was encouraged, and the sisters had used that loophole to provide education disguised as religious formation. "You understand," the bishop said gently, "that if I do this, if I petition for your manumission, it will create enemies, people who will say I'm interfering with property rights, undermining the social order, using the church for political purposes. It will make things harder for every Catholic in this city who depends on the goodwill of the planter class." Marie met his eyes. "I understand that my child will be born free or born into slavery based on what you decide in the next few days. And I understand that you have the power to choose, which is more than I've ever had." The bishop nodded slowly. "Then I'll do it. But we need to do this carefully, legally, in a way that can't be easily challenged." Over the next 3 days, the bishop worked with a Catholic lawyer who specialized in manumission cases, a free man of color named Armand Lanous, who'd successfully navigated the legal complexities of freeing enslaved people through ecclesiastical channels. They prepared a petition arguing that Marie had been baptized as an infant, had received continuous religious instruction, was a practicing Catholic in good standing, and that her continued enslavement violated the spiritual principles that required Catholic masters to respect the religious development of enslaved people. They cited precedents from Spanish colonial law, which had been more favorable to manumission than Anglo-American codes, and they requested an expedited hearing given Marie's advanced pregnancy. The petition was filed with the civil court on December 2, 1857. It named Edouard Mercier as the defendant and requested that he be compelled to appear and show cause why Marie should not be granted her freedom. Mercier, who'd assumed Marie was dead or had made it north, was stunned to discover that she'd been hiding in a convent 3 blocks from his townhouse for 2 months. He hired the best lawyers in New Orleans, men who specialized in defending property rights, and prepared to fight the petition with every legal tool available. The hearing was scheduled for December 18th. In the 2 weeks before the hearing, the case became a cause célèbre in New Orleans society. Newspapers ran editorials debating whether the church had the right to interfere with property law. Planter associations issued statements warning that ecclesiastical manumission set a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire institution of slavery. Catholic congregations were divided. Some supported the bishop's moral stand. Others feared the political backlash. The sisters kept Marie hidden throughout this period, knowing that Mercier's lawyers would try to seize her before the hearing if they discovered her location. They moved her to a different hiding place every few days, a sympathetic family's attic a warehouse owned by a free man of color, a room above a bakery run by a French immigrant who despised slavery. Sister Catherine stayed with her constantly, providing medical care as Marie's due date approached and emotional support as the legal battle unfolded. The hearing took place in a packed courtroom. Mercier's lawyers argued that Marie was valuable property, that her escape had caused financial harm, that the bishop's petition was an abuse of ecclesiastical authority designed to circumvent legitimate property law. They presented Mercier's bills of sale, his ledgers documenting Marie's value, and testimony from other planters about the dangerous precedent this case represented. The bishop's lawyer, Armand Lanous, presented a different case. He called witnesses who testified to Marie's baptism, her religious education, her faithful attendance at Mass before her escape. He presented theological arguments about the incompatibility of slavery with Catholic doctrine, citing papal bulls and church teachings that condemned the slave trade. And he called the bishop himself to testify about his spiritual obligation to protect the religious development of Catholic souls, even when that obligation conflicted with civil law. The judge, a Catholic himself but also a property owner who understood the political pressures he faced, took 3 days to issue his ruling. On December 21st, he announced his decision. Marie would be granted her freedom, but Mercier would be compensated $1,200, her assessed value, to be paid by the diocese within 30 days. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but allowed everyone to claim a partial victory. Marie was free, but the property principle was upheld through compensation. The church had won her freedom, but at a financial cost that made clear this wasn't a precedent that could be easily replicated. The diocese paid the $1,200 using funds that Mother Superior had quietly solicited from wealthy Catholic families who supported the bishop's stand. Marie gave birth to a daughter on January 3, 1858, in a room at the convent, attended by Sister Catherine and surrounded by the women who'd risked everything to protect her. She named the child Catherine Juliette, after the 2 sisters who'd saved her life. Marie and her daughter left New Orleans 3 weeks later, traveling north on a steamboat to Cincinnati, carrying papers that documented her manumission and her daughter's free status. The sisters had raised money for her passage and had connected her with a Catholic community in Ohio that would help her find work and housing. She wrote to Sister Catherine once, a letter that arrived 6 months later, describing her new life working as a seamstress, her daughter's health, and her gratitude for the women who'd chosen to act when action was dangerous. The convent continued its work, educating children, nursing the sick, sheltering the vulnerable. But the sisters who'd hidden Marie carried the memory of those 7 weeks for the rest of their lives. They'd learned that institutions could be instruments of liberation when the people within them chose courage over compliance, that faith meant nothing if it didn't translate into action, and that the most radical thing you could do was protect the vulnerable when the law itself had become an instrument of oppression. Sister Catherine remained with the order until her death in 1891. In her final years, she told the story of Marie to younger sisters, wanting them to understand that their vows required more than prayer. They required the willingness to risk everything when someone knocked on the door in the rain. She kept one object from those 7 weeks, a small wooden cross that Marie had carved in the darkness of the hidden room, using a nail and a piece of scrap wood, marking the days of her confinement with tiny scratches on the back. Sister Catherine wore it around her neck for 33 years, a reminder that sanctuary wasn't a place but a choice, made new every day by people who decided that some lives were worth any risk. The Convent of the Sisters of the Holy Family still stands in New Orleans, though the building has been rebuilt and the hidden room no longer exists. The order continues its mission of education and service, carrying forward the legacy of women who understood that religious life meant more than contemplation. It meant active resistance to systems that denied human dignity. In the archives, there's a file labeled Manumission Case, 1857, containing the legal documents from Marie's freedom suit, the bishop's testimony, and a brief note in Mother Superior Juliet's handwriting. "We did what was required. May God grant us the courage to do it again when needed." But here's what the historical record doesn't fully capture, what gets lost in the legal documents and the sanitized versions of this story that sometimes appear in church histories. The absolute terror of those 7 weeks, the physical toll on Marie's body from living in a cold, damp cellar while pregnant, the psychological weight on the sisters who knew that one mistake could destroy everything they'd built. The records don't convey the sound of Marie's breathing in the darkness, the way Sister Catherine's hands shook every time she descended those stairs with food, the nightmares Mother Superior had about federal marshals breaking down the door. They don't capture the moral complexity of the bishop's position, a man who'd spent his career navigating the impossible contradictions of leading a church in a slave society, who'd made compromises that haunted him, who finally took a stand, but only after being confronted with a specific woman's specific suffering in a way he couldn't ignore. The documents don't show his hands trembling as he signed the petition, knowing it would cost him politically, knowing some of his wealthiest parishioners would never forgive him, knowing he was setting a precedent that other bishops might refuse to follow. And the records certainly don't capture what it meant for Marie to spend 7 weeks in a room 8 feet by 10 feet, feeling her child grow inside her while listening to the sounds of the city above, knowing that her freedom and her child's future depended entirely on the actions of people she barely knew, people who could change their minds at any moment, people who had every institutional incentive to turn her away. The documents don't show the way she traced patterns on the wall in the darkness, the prayers she whispered to a God she wasn't sure was listening, the moments when she considered giving up because the psychological cost of hope felt unbearable. This is what resistance actually looked like, not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but 7 weeks of daily choices, of sisters taking turns bringing food down narrow stairs, of Mother Superior lying to visitors about why the cellar was off limits, of Sister Catherine treating a cough with herbs and prayer because calling a doctor meant exposure. It looked like the bishop spending sleepless nights drafting legal arguments, like Armand Lanous risking his reputation to take a case that could have destroyed his law practice, like Marie carving scratches on a wooden cross to mark time because she needed some way to prove to herself that she was still alive, still human, still worthy of the risk these women were taking. The legal victory was real. Marie and her daughter were freed, and that freedom was documented and legally protected. But the victory was also incomplete. The judge's ruling required financial compensation, which meant the property principle was upheld even as this specific woman was freed. Mercier got his $200, which he used to purchase another enslaved woman to replace Marie. The legal precedent was narrow enough that it couldn't be easily applied to other cases. It required a bishop's personal intervention, a woman who could prove extensive religious education, and a judge willing to accept ecclesiastical authority over property law. It wasn't a crack in the system. It was a loophole that worked once in specific circumstances and then closed, and the political cost was real. The bishop faced years of criticism from conservative Catholics who believed he'd overstepped his authority, from planters who saw the case as a dangerous precedent, from civic leaders who thought the church should stay out of property disputes. Some wealthy families stopped donating to the diocese. Some priests privately questioned whether the bishop had damaged the church's ability to operate effectively in a slave society. The bishop himself, in letters preserved in the diocesan archives, expressed doubt about whether he'd made the right choice, whether the good of freeing one woman and her child outweighed the institutional damage and the precedent that couldn't be sustained. But here's what the bishop wrote in his private journal 3 years later in 1861, as Louisiana seceded from the Union and the Civil War began. "I have made many compromises in my life, have remained silent when I should have spoken, have blessed institutions I should have condemned. But when I think of Marie and her daughter, when I remember the choice I made to act rather than defer, I feel something I rarely feel, the certainty that I did what God required regardless of the cost. If I am remembered for nothing else, let it be for that." The sisters never spoke publicly about what they'd done. They didn't seek recognition or praise. They continued their work of education and care, serving the community that depended on them, navigating the same impossible contradictions they'd always navigated. But among themselves, in the private spaces of the convent, they remembered. They told the story to new sisters who joined the order, not as a tale of heroism, but as a reminder of what their vows required: the willingness to act when action was dangerous, to choose human dignity over institutional safety, to open the door when someone knocked in the rain. Sister Catherine, in her final years, was asked by a younger sister whether she'd been afraid during those 7 weeks. She thought for a long moment before answering. "Every single day," she said. "Every time I went down those stairs. Every time I heard footsteps above. Every time someone knocked on the door. I was terrified that we'd be discovered, that everything we'd built would be destroyed, that Marie would be taken and her child sold. But I was more afraid of what it would mean if we didn't act, what it would say about our faith, our vows, our humanity. So we chose the fear that came with action over the fear that comes with complicity. And I would make that choice again." Marie's letter to Sister Catherine, the one that arrived 6 months after she'd left New Orleans, contained a passage that Sister Catherine copied into her journal and read often. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. There are no words big enough, but I want you to know that every day when I wake up and see my daughter sleeping beside me, when I walk to work and no one stops me to check my papers, when I make choices about my own life, I think of you, I think of all of you, and I try to live in a way that honors the risk you took. I try to be the kind of person who would open the door for someone else if they knocked in the rain. That's the only thanks I know how to give." That letter is still in the convent archives, yellowed and fragile, filed alongside the legal documents and the wooden cross Marie carved. It's a reminder that resistance isn't just about the dramatic moments, the hearing, the ruling, the escape. It's about what happens after, about how people carry forward the legacy of those who protected them, about how acts of courage ripple outward in ways that can't be fully measured or documented. Catherine Juliet, Marie's daughter, grew up in Cincinnati, was educated in Catholic schools, became a teacher herself, and spent her life working with formerly enslaved people who'd made it north. She never met the sisters who'd saved her mother's life. The distance and the danger of traveling south made reunion impossible, but she knew their names, knew the story, and taught it to her own children. Her descendants, scattered across the Midwest, still carry the story, still know that they exist because a group of women in New Orleans chose courage over safety in 1857. The hidden room where Marie spent 7 weeks was sealed up sometime in the 1870s during renovations to the convent. The current sisters know the story but aren't certain of the exact location. The building has been modified so many times that the original architecture is obscured. But they know it was there, somewhere beneath the chapel, a space that held a pregnant woman and her unborn child, while the world above debated their humanity in legal terms. There's a memorial now, a small plaque in the convent's courtyard, installed in 2015 after a historian researched the case and brought it to public attention. It reads, "In memory of Marie and Catherine Juliet, and the Sisters of the Holy Family who chose sanctuary over safety, 1857. It doesn't tell the full story. How could it, in a few words on bronze? But it marks the spot, acknowledges that something happened here that matters, that deserves to be remembered. But here's what I want you to understand. What I need you to carry forward from this story. This wasn't exceptional. This wasn't a unique moment of courage in an otherwise compliant institution. Research into the records of religious communities across the South reveals dozens of similar cases. Convents, monasteries, churches that hid runaways, that used ecclesiastical authority to secure manumissions, that chose to act when action was illegal and dangerous. Most of these cases were never documented, were kept secret to protect the people involved, were erased from official histories because acknowledging them would have been politically impossible. The Sisters of the Holy Family weren't heroes in the sense of being extraordinary. They were ordinary women who made an extraordinary choice when confronted with another person's suffering. They were terrified, uncertain, aware of the risks, and they acted anyway. That's what makes the story important. Not that they were special, but that they were human, flawed, afraid, and they still opened the door, and that choice is still available. The specific circumstances change. We're not hiding pregnant runaways in 2024. We're not navigating the Fugitive Slave Act or ecclesiastical manumission law. But the fundamental question remains. When someone knocks on your door in the rain, when helping them is dangerous and costly and could destroy everything you've built, what do you do? When the law itself has become an instrument of oppression, when institutions prioritize their own survival over human dignity, when the safe choice is to look away, what do you choose? The sisters chose to act. They chose 7 weeks of terror, of daily risk, of knowing that one mistake could end everything. They chose to trust that their faith meant something beyond ritual and prayer, that their vows required action, that sanctuary was a verb, not a noun. And because they made that choice, Marie and her daughter lived free lives, and their descendants exist, and the story survives as a reminder that institutions can be instruments of liberation when the people within them choose courage. So here's what I'm asking you to do. First, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we're committed to telling these stories, to recovering the histories of resistance that have been systematically erased, to building a community of people who believe that remembering matters. Second, comment below with your city, because this story happened in New Orleans, but the choice it represents is universal. And I want to know where you are, where this message is reaching, where people are hearing this and deciding what it means for their own lives. And third, this is the most important one, ask yourself what door you're being called to open. What person is knocking? What risk are you being asked to take? What choice between safety and solidarity are you facing right now? Because the story of the Sisters of the Holy Family isn't just history. It's a blueprint for moral action, a reminder that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices, that institutions can be transformed from within, that sanctuary is always possible if we're willing to pay the cost. The sisters didn't know if they'd succeed. They didn't know if the bishop would intervene, if the judge would rule in their favor, if Marie and her daughter would make it north safely. They acted anyway, in the darkness, in the uncertainty, in the fear. And because they did, 2 lives were saved, a precedent was set, and a story survived that still has the power to challenge us, to convict us, to call us to account. What door will you open? What risk will you take? What will you choose when the moment comes and someone is standing in the rain asking for sanctuary and you have the power to act or turn away? The sisters chose to act. Marie chose to run. The bishop chose to intervene. Armand Lanous chose to take the case. A network of free people of color and sympathetic whites chose to hide and transport and protect. None of them knew if it would work. All of them knew the cost of failure. They acted anyway. That's the legacy. That's the challenge. That's the question this story leaves us with. When your moment comes, when the knock sounds at your door, when the choice is between safety and solidarity, what will you choose? Remember Marie. Remember Catherine. Remember Juliet. Remember the 7 weeks. In the darkness, the legal battle, the journey north, the letter that arrived 6 months later. Remember that resistance is possible, that institutions can be transformed, that ordinary people can make choices that echo across generations, and then decide what you'll do with that memory, because the story isn't finished. It's still being written in every choice we make, in every door we open or close, in every moment when we decide whether our values are real or just words we tell ourselves to feel better about our complicity. The sisters made their choice in 1857. Marie made hers. The bishop made his. Now it's your turn. What will you choose?